As you know, we're going through the characters of the Old Testament. We looked at Abraham, we looked at Isaac and Jacob. Today, we're going to look at Joseph. His story is very long. I am not going to read every single verse. I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view of his life. And then at the end, we're going to look to see what we can learn from his life, from his example. You know, those people who are able to learn from other people's lives, successes and failures, will save themselves a lot of heartache, pain, and loss. That's why the scriptures give us these characters, the truth about their lives, their mistakes to learn from, their strengths and godliness to take example of and replicate in our lives. So let's see what we can learn from Joseph. Now Joseph comes into the picture in the book of Genesis, chapter 37. We are told that he was a young man of 17, and verse 3 gives us this detail. Genesis 37:3. Now Israel, you know, is actually Jacob. When he completely surrendered his life to God and started following after him and stopped doing things his way but started doing things God's way, God renamed him as Israel. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. Now, some things are generational. Some call it generational curses. Basically, what they mean by that is dysfunctional thoughts and habits that pass on from one generation to another. Alcoholism is one of them. Drug use is another. Certain attitudes of pride and condescension, manipulation is another one. It gets passed down from generation to generation to generation. How does that happen? Well, you see it in your grandma, you see it in your grandpa, you see it in your mom or dad, and you do the same thing. There's a rule. What you do in moderation, your children will do in excess. What you do very little, your children will do a lot more of. If you're a little bit prideful, your children will be more prideful. If you drink 3 beers, your children will drink a bottle of scotch. If you use little drugs, your children will use a lot more. If you're very little manipulative, your children will be a lot more manipulative. That's the rule. That's what is known as the generational curse. It's actually dysfunction that is learned in the environment. Therefore, Jacob, before he was Israel, was the favorite of his mom, remember? So that he's passing along to his son Joseph now. The things that we learn, like we said, by the mistakes of others. Well, here's one of them. Dysfunction must stop with us. Dysfunction must stop with us. It cannot go into the next generation. If you know if there is dysfunction in your family, in your upbringing, it is your responsibility to stop it immediately. You say it comes here, but goes no further. It must stop. Since we know better, God has given us the ability to comprehend, understand, have the knowledge, have the wisdom, therefore it must stop. Jacob didn't do that. He still showed favoritism. and look at the mess it created. His brothers hated him. Joseph had a dream. He told this to his brothers. I'm at verse 5 now. They hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves, the sheaves you were gathering around me, fell down and bowed down to me." That did not make them feel good. They already didn't like him because he was being a favorite of his dad. Now, this kid, in his brother's minds, was thinking that he's something, he's all that. In essence, to give Joseph credit, he wasn't actually feeling or thinking that. He was just simply sharing the dream he had. And to Jacob's credit, Joseph was born after he moved to Bethel, after he had surrendered his life to God. So Joseph got to see his father, not like his brothers when their dad was conniving, manipulating, and lying and cheating. But Joseph saw him as a godly man who gave him godly advice. There is that effect in his life too. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams. And then one day, Israel's sons go with their flock. Remember now, he had at this point 10 other sons that he sent out various ages. So he must have had a considerable amount of cattle. So they took them for grazing somewhere. And after a few days have gone by, Jacob told his son, Joseph, "Go check on your brothers and check on the animals to see what's happening." So Joseph goes, finds them. And as they see him coming down, they hate him with his fancy coat that his father gave him and nobody else. They said, "Here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him." How do you go from resentment to killing? I don't know. For us, it seems like a big jump. But if you look at human history, if you look at all the things that people have gone through, even if you listen to the news and watch how people go from point A to point B, a lot of times we're shocked at the evil that can come out from inside people. Things that happened during a war, things that happened during the genocide. How has that happened? Where is that source of evil? Well, we all have them. It comes with the Adamic nature. So they wanted to kill him. They despised him. They didn't like him. And they thought that he thought he was better than them. So they wanted to get rid of him. Make a long story short, they decided to first kill him. And then they decided not to kill him, but to throw him into the cistern and leave him there. And then they decided, you know what? Why are we just going to leave him there? Let's sell him to these Arabs that are coming by, the spice traders who are going to Egypt. Let's sell it to them. At least we'll make some money, they thought. So they sold him. They took him out of the pit that they threw him in. But imagine in the midst of all this, Joseph. He's going there to check on his brothers. All of a sudden, they grab him. They take his coat. They throw him into the pit. And after a while, he's there. We don't know how long. And then somebody throws a rope down and pulls him up. He's probably all happy. Okay, my brothers are not going to hurt me and this and that. And they sell him into slavery. He's crying. He's begging them, please don't do this. They didn't care. They sold him into slavery. So, we skip to chapter 39. He gets sold to Potiphar. He was one of Pharaoh's officials in Egypt. He is the captain of the guard. But we're told that the Lord was with Joseph. This is 39, verse 2. So that he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in the eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of all his household, and he entrusted him with the care of everything he owned. From the time that he put him in charge and all that he owned, the Lord has blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was upon everything Potiphar had, both the house and in it and the field that was in it. So that the Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except for the food he ate. So God is with Joseph. Here's this young man, energetic, positive, eager, godly. He's doing the right thing. And God is blessing him. Okay? God is blessing him. And other people notice, so they elevate him, which is great. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, we're told. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't go near it. He said, nope. He would run out of the room every time she came in. And then one day she trapped him. She left there, told all the servants to leave the house. Joseph comes in. He says, "There's nobody here. My husband is not home. Come be with me." What does Joseph do? He's a single young man. He doesn't justify it. He doesn't say, "Oh, well, you know." No. He doesn't say everybody is doing it or nobody will know. None of that. What does he do? He runs away. She grabs onto his cloak, but he just runs away. He doesn't even want to be there. It's a good picture for us to deal with temptation. Whenever you're hit with temptation, the best thing to do is get out of there. Whether if it's in your mind, whether if it's physically in a situation or a place, get out of there. That's the right idea every single time. And then she accuses him. She says, "He tried sleeping with me. I screamed. He ran away, so I got his cloak right here." So her husband hears this. He flips out and puts him in the dungeon. In the dungeon, God is with him again. Even though he's there because of nothing he did, he's innocent. He's done the right thing, yet bad things are happening to him. First, his brothers, his family, does that to him. Now, he said, "Okay, let me start a new life." He's a slave. That's not fun. But at least he's doing his best. He's prospering. He's doing the right thing. Bam, this happens. So he's in prison. How would you feel? You keep doing the right thing. These bad things happen to you. How would you feel? Would you say, I give up? He didn't. You know, when Potiphar's wife was trying to entice him, you know what Joseph's answer was to her? "My master put me in charge of everything. You're his wife." This is what he said next. "How can I do this sin against Potiphar? No. Against God. You see, this is one big lesson we get from Joseph. He knew exactly who his God was and who he was in return. He knew exactly what God's expectation of him was. He knew he was accountable to God more than anybody else. He was always playing to the audience of one. Not to the people around him, not to his family circle and friends, not his church buddies, not the Christian clique, not the social media pages. He was always playing to the audience of one, who's God. That is so key for us in our daily life. It's so important to know that God is what matters. What he wants and what he sees is what really matters in our life. And he sees our heart, he sees our actions, he sees our intents too. So Joseph got that right. Because of that, because his relationship with him was where it needed to be, his attitude was always positive. Even in prison, he excels. He comes to the point where the warden doesn't care anymore. Joseph is in charge. How does that happen? What kind of an attitude must you have to be that kind of a person? A lot of times we find ourselves in dungeons. Of feelings, of situations, of circumstances, not literal dungeons. But our attitude is what's going to save us from those dark places, from those wrong directions. Attitude of our heart is what's going to make a difference. Knowledge of Almighty and my relationship to Him is going to catapult that attitude and energize, Lord willing, and get you out of there and prosper you and excel you. Two other characters are introduced to us while he's in prison, while he's running the prison. Now, Pharaoh is upset with his baker. Maybe the bread wasn't risen enough, we don't know. Maybe the cookies weren't sweet enough, we don't know. He didn't like whatever the baker did, he goes into prison. And he also threw his cupbearer in there. Cupbearer is basically like personal butler. Right? He brings him his drinks and he tastes it, makes sure there's no poison and all that kind of stuff. So they both end up in prison, and they both one night see a dream. And they wake up in the morning, they're both distressed. Joseph comes along, probably upbeat and happy. Hey, good morning, guys, what's happening? They're like moping and they're not happy. He says, what happened? He says, well, we had a dream. I had a dream. He says, okay. He said, the interpretation of the dream, this is also another point, belongs to the Lord. But tell me, what was it? They both tell them their dreams. Fast forward, he says, the meaning of your dream is this. The baker is going to be put to death in 3 days, and the cupbearer is going to go back to his position as a cupbearer in 3 days. That's exactly what happens. Right before cupbearer goes to his position, Joseph tells him, please remember me when you're there. Of course, what does the cupbearer do? Forgets him immediately as soon as he starts. 2 more years go by. Would you have given up? God knows I would. He didn't, this guy. And Pharaoh has a dream one day, 2 years later. Pharaoh has this dream. He asks his people, his wise men, his magicians. Nobody knows what it means. And the cupbearer remembers. He says, oh, there was this guy in prison. He interpreted our dreams and it came just true. And I remember he told me to remember him. I forgot. I just remembered him today. He says, if Pharaoh would get that guy, he would tell him his dreams, the meaning of his dreams. In his dream, Pharaoh sees 7 healthy, fat cows and 7 skinny, unhealthy cows. And he sees that those skinny, unhealthy cows eat the fat ones. Then he wakes up. He goes back to sleep. He sees this healthy grain with 7 heads of healthy grain. And then he sees another one sprouting up with 7 heads of unhealthy grain. And those 7 unhealthy grains eat the healthy one. So Pharaoh can't figure out what's happening. And to Joseph, Genesis 41, verse 14. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly before he was brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I heard that it was said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Listen to what Joseph said to Pharaoh. The guy, the man who could set him free and change his life immediately. What did he say? Verse 16, I cannot do it. What would you have said? Sure, tell me. I got this. What could go wrong? Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But the continuation shows character of Joseph. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. You see, it was never ever about him. And it wasn't a showy humility. It wasn't for show. It was for real. How do we know? Because of the way he lived his life. His humility was not make-believe. His humility was not orchestrated, programmed. It wasn't a hologram. It was real. He truly thought that he couldn't do it. He truly believed that God would. And only he could. So Pharaoh tells him the dream, and then Joseph interprets it and says, you're going to have 7 good years with a lot of crops coming in. It's going to be followed by 7 really bad years. It's going to take away the abundance of those 7 years. So Joseph also comes up with a solution. He says that tell everybody, put people in charge, tell everybody to collect 20% of the increase so that you can put it in silos in every city so that when the 7 years of bad comes, you can take it from there. So Pharaoh looks at this and he talks to his council. They say, we don't need to look for anybody. You're the guy. You're the man. From this point on, you will be in charge of Egypt. You will be second only to me. Pharaoh says, and takes off his signet ring and gives it to him. Joseph is probably shocked. Doesn't know. The best he could have hoped for was to get his freedom. But he is now second to Pharaoh overnight. There's a lot to discuss there, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to fast forward to his brothers. 7 years of plenty come and go. Joseph is ruling the land, and famine begins. Famine also hits his father's family. So they need grain. They can't find it. The fields are not producing. So they hear that there's grain in Egypt. So Israel says to his sons, go to Egypt, buy some grain, and come back. They go there. They stand before Joseph. They have no idea that's Joseph. They're speaking among themselves. Joseph realizes who they are immediately. What would you have done? But in order to have them keep coming, after he gives them the grain that they came to buy, he doesn't reveal himself. But in order to have them keep coming, he holds one of them. He says, well, you guys are spies. What you're telling me is true, go bring your youngest brother, who is Joseph's real brother from the same mom. And their dad does not want to go for this because he already lost Joseph, and Simeon is also there being held hostage. He says, there is no way that I'm letting go of my youngest son, Benjamin. Not going to happen. Anyway, he comes to his senses, and they beg him, and the oldest guy takes responsibility. He says, you kill me and my children if I don't come back. Get him safe. They go there to get the rest of the grain, and Joseph plays a trick on them. He puts a silver cup in Benjamin's sack, and his soldiers find it. They say, oh, that's it. He stole Joseph's silver cup. This kid's going to stay here. They knew their dad would die. So that's why they started begging. And he said, I'll be your slave. Let the kid go. My dad will die if he doesn't go back. Anyway, Joseph cannot take it anymore. And these parts are pretty emotional. I recommend that you read it from chapter 45. Because of time, I'm not going through everything in detail. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. I would love to be in that room when he said, I am Joseph, to these guys. What do you think they felt? Fear, amazement, disbelief, all at once, terror. I am Joseph, is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. They're really afraid. And his next sentence starts by, and now, what do you think he would say? Now you're all dead. Now I'm going to kill all of you. That's what they were expecting. But what does he say? Verse 5, 45, 5. And now, do not be distressed. And do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. He gets the big picture. How many times do we lose in life because we don't get the big picture? How many times we don't obey God, His ways, His direction, His principles, His teachings, because we only see what we see and we don't see the big picture. You see, the lesson from Joseph is, even though he was in the bottom of the pit, even though he was taken out and sold into slavery, even though when he did his best, he was thrown into the dungeon, he didn't see the big picture. But don't lose this point. He knew the one who could. Not only that, he trusted him. And because of that, he didn't question things. He did what God wanted him to do the way he wanted him to do it. He obeyed God. He trusted him with the consequences. Our problem is we see our own circumstances with our own limited vision, and we trust our own senses rather than God. We don't see what's going to happen tomorrow, next month, next year, 10 years from now. We don't know how we fit in the big picture. We only know now. So this is where the rubber meets the road. What am I going to do when the circumstance I'm in doesn't make sense to me? Am I going to follow God, His ways, His teachings? Or am I going to do what I think is right? Lesson from Abraham, lesson from Jacob. Their failures were because they didn't trust God. They looked at the circumstance and they did what they thought was right, in spite of what God had said. So my question to you today, is there anything in your life that God is telling you to do certain things, certain ways, but because you can see your way out of it, you're about to make a desperate decision? I tell you, don't do it. Look at all these examples we have in front of us. Even though you might feel like you're in the bottom of the pit, even though you might feel like you're in the dungeon, even though it's been 2 years, you're still in the dungeon, the guy forgot about you, who could have helped you be saved. Don't give up hope, because you don't know what's around the corner. You don't know the big picture. You just do what God is telling you to do. That's the difference between a believer and an unbeliever. They asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love God, love your neighbor. I asked him, how do we show that we love God? He said, do what He says. If you love God, you do what He says. Joseph did what God wanted him to do. He didn't give up hope. He was not discouraged. He was not in despair. We all have moments. We will. I'm sure he had his too. But his understanding depended on trust to God. He trusted God. Even though it didn't make sense to him, he trusted God and he did his best. So the lesson from Joseph, the rest of the story goes, he sends for his father. His father doesn't believe his brothers. He says, come on, my son is dead. Don't play with me. But Joseph sends 10 limos with him. They're called carts in the Old Testament. To bring all the family and everything. So 70 of them come into Egypt. Right? They live in abundance. Jacob is again a happy man after 20 years. It's interesting. I don't know if this means anything, but from his escape after his conniving and cheating, his escape from his brother, and his coming back point was 20 years. And then from losing Joseph and him reuniting with Joseph is also 20 years. 20 years later, he's reunited. The circle is complete. He's happy. He's content. Family's safe. Everybody's together. And he can die in peace. And even the bigger picture, which neither one of them do, that with the protection of Egypt, they grew. 70 people grew into 2 million people. At the end, it wasn't so much fun because they turned into slaves. And then God rescued them. That's called the book of Exodus. But the lesson from Joseph, even though it doesn't make sense at times, a lot of times it does, but at times it doesn't. We do things God's way. When He says, do it. And we trust Him, not losing our hope. The difference between let me use myself as an example, the difference between me and Joseph is our attitude. He never gave up hope. He was always doing the right thing, even though everything around him was crumbling and he had no reason to. I give up a lot easier than Joseph does. He didn't. He held on to his faith, to his God, and he never let go. And same lesson is for us. We're all going through certain situations in life. Some of you are about to make big decisions. Some of you are going through consequences of decisions. If none of those things, in everyday life, we are confronted with small or large decisions we need to make. And all these decisions must be guided through our faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. Without that, it's meaningless. Without that, it's only the immediate desire, immediate gratification, immediate results. But anything that matters in life will be done through faith and surrender to Jesus. Only then we can be a part of the big picture. So, lesson from him again, to have the right attitude, even if the circumstances doesn't warrant it. God bless you.